Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our live webinar. The topic for today is building resilience through strategic warehousing. We have plenty of insights and customer experiences to share with you. Our agenda will be 30 minutes of conversation-style sharing, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. Just some quick housekeeping items before we begin. The chat functionality, as well as the speaking and camera options, have been disabled for all attendees. So please use the Q&A area to ask any questions that you have, and we'll address those at the end. And let's get started. So I'm Hillary Ross Rojas, Customer Insights Manager for North America here at Maersk, and I'm based in Richmond, Virginia, where it is 100+ degrees for the third day in a row. So apologies if you catch me needing to wipe my brow because it is just unbearably hot and humid here right now. I hope you all are attending today from cooler locations. I've been with Maersk for almost 3 years, but my experience in market research and customer insights spans over 15 years, mainly focused on service sectors. And I just enjoy solving the puzzles of human behavior, and that's what keeps me in this career. I'm here today with Fred Gilbert, and I'll turn it over to you, Fred, to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Hillary. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. As Hillary mentioned, I'm Fred Gilbert. I head up product strategy and growth enablement for Maersk Contract Logistics in North America. And in that role, I oversee product development and growth for our suite of contract logistics products, which includes fulfillment, transload, e-fulfillment, and cold storage within the region. I've been in the logistics industry quite some time, and I've been with Maersk for a little over 10 years. Unlike Hillary, it's not too hot where I am today in Los Angeles, where I live with my family and love spending time outside when I'm not talking or discussing warehousing with customers. So super excited about our discussion today and look forward to getting started.
That's great, Fred. I'm really jealous of your weather. I'll just put that out there now. So there's a lot going on in the world today. All signs are pointing to disruption, but that's no longer really a scary anomaly in supply chain logistics. It's now just part of everyday business for us. And honestly, it's universal. A study from McKinsey came across my desk recently that indicated 90% of companies globally are still grappling with supply chain resiliency in the face of disruptions. Though the pandemic is behind us, evidence suggests that supply chain disruptions that we're seeing are continuing to rise. One estimate that I read puts the year-over-year increase at 38% for 2024. And I think we've already seen enough in the first half of this year to believe that 2025 is shaping up to see an even bigger increase. In my view, this trend really underscores the need for businesses to adapt and to find ways to build more resilient supply chains. And Fred, you know as well as I do that warehousing strategy really sits at the heart of that. I mean, let's just look at some of the examples of disruptions that have recently affected supply chains globally. So first off, the Red Sea attacks on commercial shipping. Over 18 months ago now, we saw the Houthi rebels in Yemen protesting the war in Gaza cross international waters and disrupt international trade through repeated attacks on ocean vessels. The entire transportation and logistics industry had to adjust by avoiding the Red Sea, leading shippers to adjust production and supply chain strategies to now longer transit times. We're seeing that conflict continue and expand now. The region is really being disrupted again by the conflict between Israel and Iran as well. And although it seems distantly behind us now, the port strikes in both the US and Canada late last year, which had the potential to cause extreme disruption to the tune of $5 billion per day in the US, led to front-loading and stockpiling inventory before peak season, particularly for consumer goods. So while disruptions like port strikes often have some level of predictability and forewarning, the next two disruptions that I'll touch on give very little warning or insight on the magnitude and scope of the disruptions that they present. First, major weather or seismic events like earthquakes and hurricanes can have a devastating localized impact on supply chains, really demolishing, manufacturing facilities, transportation networks, logistics infrastructure like warehouses and ports. In recent years, on average, there are $23 billion weather and climate disasters per year in the US. And according to the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, in 2024 alone, there were 27 such disasters. Hurricane Helene alone last September caused nearly 80 million in damages. And cyber attacks are on the rise as well and are impacting global supply chains. In 2024, the average cost of a data breach was almost 5 million, up 10% from 2023. And in total this year, cyber attacks are estimated to reach over 600 billion in damages in the US. For example, just a month ago, a global women's apparel retailer faced a cybersecurity breach over Memorial Day weekend that caused it to need to shut down its website and pause in-store services while they assessed the impact. It delayed orders during an important shopping holiday, prevented customers from making returns, and really impacted, the brand to the tune of $10 million. And this month, a wholesale grocery food distributor faced a cyber attack and had to pause operations, preventing grocery stores from placing orders and leading to bare shelves in some cases. And last, the disruption that I think is probably most top of mind for everyone are the global tariffs. As we see them, go into effect and then be paused, only to be scaled down or ramped up, sometimes changing within a day. So global geopolitical instability and trade and tariffs are really the top concerns that we're seeing for US CEOs this spring, according to the conference board. And at a high level, how are companies reacting to this? We've seen them talk about changing their sourcing strategies, moving production, building new facilities in less impacted areas. But this is, of course, easier said than done, and not every company is able to turn that quickly. And so that's, why plans have been in place or in play since before the tariffs were even announced. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce notes that over 90% of companies are already implementing a supplier diversification model or planning to do so soon. So that's not just in response to the tariff situation, but global geopolitical uncertainty and disruption more broadly. However, bringing supply chains back to the US could more than double the cost of manufacturing for many companies, surveyed in a recent CNBC supply chain leader survey. So, taking these actions to increase resiliency for the long term would almost certainly disrupt operations in the short and even medium term. So Fred, what are some disruptions that you see contract logistics customers as particularly vulnerable to?
Sure, Hillary. So, I think warehousing in particular is one of the most crucial components of the supply chain logistics puzzle. In many cases, it's the last node in the supply chain before a product goes to the final consumer. And because of that, it's really critical that the warehouse or the warehouse network is able to flex and handle the impact of disruptions as best as possible. So, when I think about disruptions, I think of those that impact the warehouse on kind of a macro level and then also more of a micro level. So macro would be something major, many of which you mentioned, right, that has a ripple effect really across the supply chain. COVID's a great example, port strikes, wars, conflicts, and of course, tariffs that you mentioned. On a micro level, there's, things that happen within a business that create demand spikes and, can lead to potential disruptions if not properly planned for. Think of, a hot product launch that, goes 10x what it was expected to do, or an influencer who creates new demand for an existing product overnight, and you walk into many more orders than you had expected. So those types of kind of micro impacts can also lead to disruptions as well within the warehouse. But I think our focus today is really going to be on more of those macro types of disruptions, many of which you already mentioned. And certainly when we sit back and look at the world over the past couple of months, the disruption that's really front and center for us right now is tariffs. And while we've seen companies fall into kind of a wait and see attitude at first, given the many changes that were happening from a regulatory environment, now we're seeing things settle down a little bit, and there's a big push to get product onto the shelves just as quickly as possible, particularly prior to the holiday peak season.
That's a good point, Fred. Are there any particular cases you can share about a customer who's working to get product on their shelves now versus taking that wait and see approach, and tell us about how that's working out for them?
Sure. So we've seen a number of different examples. One in particular, we had a consumer electronics customer that pulled up their timeline to open a Canadian warehouse. They had it on their 3 to 4 year plan, but based upon what happened, particularly due to tariffs, they decided to accelerate that. So currently, they bring freight into the U.S. and have a U.S. warehouse that distributes product back into the Canadian market. But in this new model that they're pursuing, they'll be able to mitigate some of the tariff impact by bringing the freight directly into Canada, setting up a Canadian distribution center and distributing from there. So that's one example that I think resonated with me, given what's going on lately. In another example, we've seen one of our white goods customers, that's appliances, right, bring in considerable product once the tariffs came down, really ahead of their forecast, to take advantage of what they thought was a stabilization in tariffs to really have that product in place for peak season and then their spring season as well. So as a result of that, they came to us looking for additional warehouse space to store this product for a short period of time, until they were able to sell through it. So there's different strategies to mitigate the impacts of tariffs, and we've seen a number of different propositions applied in the current market.
That's right, and we've seen that strategy, that stocking up an advanced strategy, kind of unfold across multiple consumer-facing industries impacted by the tariffs. Think furniture and bedding, toys, sports equipment, and more. How are you seeing these types of disruptions, like the tariffs, really impact companies when it comes to their contract logistics strategies and operations?
Yeah, I think like anything, Hillary, it really just depends on the disruption, right, and how the customer is positioned, and what the specific impact is on them, as well as how the company prepared for it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But at a high level, we've seen impacts on inventory management strategies. So which facilities within a region do you hold inventory? Do you shift it if you're having trouble potentially getting things into the West Coast to the East Coast, for example? And are you able to mitigate that? Certainly, there's a cost to that, but if you can't get product in to one area, that might be the best scenario. And we've also seen customers, that pre-COVID were really predominantly focused on B2B. And so kind of coming out of COVID, they developed and grew their e-commerce strategy. And as a result of that, they had to make changes to their warehousing strategy, not only in terms of how they thought about their overall network, but also even the layout of the warehouse. Some might have deployed more automation in order to drive more velocity from an e-commerce standpoint, and really just be able to keep up with growing e-commerce demand in more of a pick and pack type operation, as opposed to more of what might have been a carton in, carton out, or pallet type operation in the past. We've also seen customers rethink how they get product into and out of the warehouse. And in my prior example, what used to be predominantly maybe outbound truckload, shipments going to big retailers, there's now the need for, parcel connections to the warehouse to do pickups for those outbound e-com orders. So that creates an impact and changes within the facility as well. And we have to adapt and adjust to those. I think the other aspect is speed to market, and tariffs certainly, highlight this. So when initially announced, again, kind of the brakes were put on in terms of shipments, particularly from China. There was also a lot of interest, and that continues, where customers are looking for bonded or FTZ space for inbound product that was already on its way, as a way to mitigate the immediate tariff impact. But again, fast forward a few weeks, and tariffs came down significantly from China, and as we talked before, companies are really shifting to look for more space, bring more product in, and make sure it can be on the shelves for the prime demand season. So disruptions have a profound impact on the warehouse, but it really depends on the specific customer and their unique situation.
They sure do. And as of last year, as we kind of touched on, we saw companies really desiring to move away from inventory buffers as the preferred way to mitigate their supply chain risks, and really strive to keep inventory consistent, or, even become leaner compared to pre-COVID levels. However, the tariffs have caused some companies to react, like you said, by rushing in merchandise, rerouting, stockpiling their inventory, and taking on overflow storage space. And as you already kind of touched on it, it really seems like companies may be moving back toward a just-in-case strategy than a just-in-time strategy, or really a hybrid approach that emphasizes having the right inventory in the right place at the right time. So I'm curious, what type of warehousing strategy shifts are you seeing companies make for the short term? So things that can be decided on and implemented relatively quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a number of things that can be done relatively quickly, and I touched on some of those. But I think one of the biggest shifts, I've seen is kind of this approach that really starts to look at different scenarios that can impact the warehouse, and making sure that companies and businesses are prepared for those. So being able to identify potential disruptions, and then deploy kind of short-term actions as well as longer-term actions is really important. And so we've seen a number of customers work on programs to better recognize and anticipate both those micro as well as those macro type of disruptions that could impact the supply chain. And I think there's really value in doing a comprehensive kind of risk or scenario assessment of your specific business to better prepare for what might come. And there's all types of software and interactive dashboards that can help monitor and somewhat predict what could be coming in the future. In addition to that, I think, just kind of touched on it earlier, but being able to develop kind of these flexible response strategies. You might think disruption A happens and you deploy strategy B, but there might be some nuance to it, and you might need to adjust. And that's really important, to be able to audible and take a bit of a different path in terms of your contingency plan and the specific characteristics of it. That might include alternative suppliers, or shifting product or freight to one region versus another. But just being able to flex in terms of your response, I think is really important, and allows you to adjust quicker to what might be on the horizon. I think the other thing is just looking at the supply chain environment as a whole, and regularly updating those strategies based upon new information. There's a lot of value in AI and some of the tools that are out there today, and being able to tap into those and better plan your response in advance is really important as well. I think many of these shifts you described, Hillary, are really enabled by different technologies as well. So we've seen more and more customers interested in automation and robotics, and things that can help just drive value within the warehouse as well. And that's something that's constantly being evaluated. Some of those are more longer term, but there's oftentimes shorter term things that can be done that'll have an impact on the warehouse as well.
Yeah, and many of the strategies that you've just mentioned are really enabled by new technologies, and that's something that we see continue to be a major trend in warehousing. Though some companies are also taking a wait and see approach to investment, those that are making investments are often doing so in automation and technology, or in enhanced technology information systems like new WMSs and ERPs. And so, Fred, are there any short-term shifts that you're seeing customers make within the four walls of the warehouse to adjust to these types of disruptions?
Yeah, I think there's a conscious focus on a few things. One, just making sure you're always maximizing kind of the space within the warehouse and looking at the layout and the operations and really just driving a deep kind of focused continuous improvement effort. It's one thing when things are going well, but when there's disruptions, there's oftentimes a need to squeeze more juice from the orange, so to speak. And so I think that's something that happens when there's disruptions. And within the four walls is kind of where the magic happens. And so what can you do in terms of the layout, in terms of how you're positioning inventory within the facility, slotting strategy, things like that to really help drive more efficiency, given the disruptions that have been going on. And certainly there's different tools, like you mentioned, Hillary, in terms of automation and robotics that can be applied as well, that really deliver a step change within the four walls of the warehouse also.
That makes sense. How about strategic shifts with a longer term horizon or impact? What are you seeing from our customers on that front?
Sure. I think one of those is really related to diversifying storage locations. So, when disruptions occur, to just have kind of a single supply chain that you rely on creates risk. And so, how do you start, if you haven't already, deploying a more diversified kind of network, right? So maybe that's two locations instead of one. Maybe that's an East Coast and a West Coast location, even though that may not perfectly match your demand profile. Those types of things are what we see customers doing as they look at a longer term horizon. I think this was in particular focus kind of during and coming out of COVID, is several of our apparel customers who previously just had a single omni-channel distribution site in Southern California. They saw value, right, in opening another location on the opposite coast to really enable this bi-coastal distribution network and mitigate the impact of potential disruptions, backlogs that we saw, particularly at the port of LA Long Beach. And that also, kind of had a byproduct effect, and that allowed them to improve speed to market and get their product to customers more quickly at the same time. Tariffs are also leading companies, to look at, bonded and FTZ warehouses, as I mentioned earlier. And I think, tariffs kind of highlighted that, but I think that's a trend we'll probably see continue as a strategy, as customers just look at ways to mitigate some of the tax and duty impact, at least in the short term, until they know exactly where that product is going to go and when. So I think that's another hot topic in the industry right now, and it takes some planning in terms of the time horizon to get those set up. There's a bit of a backlog right now with CBP, but I think we'll see that come down, and I think we'll see more customers deploy FTZs and bonded warehouses as part of their overall resilience strategy.
Yeah, and of course, these decisions don't come lightly, and companies really need to weigh the pros and cons and trade-offs of changing their warehousing strategy. So what sort of trade-offs do these companies face when they change up their, warehouse layout and flow of operations?
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded question. So a lot of things change, of course. More than anything, I think it's important to understand, why are you making changes, and really be clear about defining that. Is it to improve, overall agility, to be more cost effective, improve speed to market, higher quality, et cetera? I think it should really start there, and it should be kind of aligned with the business objectives and vision that you have, so that the supply chain follows that. think that's really important. I know when I started my career, I used to do supply chain modeling in terms of network analysis and whatnot. And one of the things I realized very quickly is it's hard to have it all, right? There's always trade-offs. There's always cost constraints. There's time constraints. There's inventory constraints, and so you really have to prioritize what's most important and focus on that. And maybe you can have a couple of those, but again, it's really difficult to have all of them. And so, I think when you're thinking about the warehouse layout and operations, how do you put changes into place and a strategy into place to ultimately get you to where you want to go with your warehousing strategy, kind of step by step and potentially in different phases.
Sure. And what are the trade-offs that companies will need to consider when they think about diversifying warehouse locations, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so like changes within the facility, it's important to understand your goals up front. It's easy to say add another warehouse, but there's impacts to that. Warehouses, are fairly expensive to set up, right? The inventory carrying costs of another facility and duplicate inventory is relatively high. So you really need to think through again why you're doing it and what makes the most sense. If you're doing e-commerce and shipping large parcels all from one facility, then it probably makes sense there to reduce your total landed costs and your parcel costs by setting up another facility. But there's tools and we help customers all the time look at the total landed costs from the inbound to the warehouse itself to the outbound transportation costs to make sure they're making the best decisions when it comes to network and location strategy. Speed to market is really become in focus, particularly in the e-commerce environment. As of late, the expectation largely is, 1 or 2 days. Sometimes 2 days isn't enough. I know my kids are like, well, where's the product at or whatnot if it doesn't come that same day. So I think as a result of that, in order to compete, a lot of customers are trying to figure out how do we get closer to the end consumer? How do we make sure our overall network strategy supports that? And we can really deliver on that high level of customer service and speed to market that the customers expect these days.
And you made a good point when you talked about how we do that with our customers. We see, in the market, partnerships with third-party logistics firms becoming more prevalent and helping companies reduce risk and improve their resiliency. Not a new trend by any means, but, for the past 2 years, warehouse leasing activity has been higher among 3PLs than among retail and consumer goods companies. And we've seen that gap widen considerably so far this year. So Fred, do you have any advice for customers on how to optimize their partnerships with 3PL warehouse providers, in making these strategic changes to overcome supply chain disruptions?
Yeah, it's a good question and something I spend a lot of my time, discussing with our customers. I think it really starts with a true partnership. I think sometimes we think just it's a buyer seller kind of arrangement, but finding a 3PL partner that really is an extension of your business and can operate your business at a high level is really just kind of the first step. And then, when changes happen, right, because of that partnership, you'll have a provider that's willing to roll up their sleeves and, not complain or not challenge, why are things happening the way they are, but just roll up their sleeves and ask, how can we get it done? And I think that's really important because it's not a matter of if, as you pointed out, Hillary, it's a matter of when's the next disruption coming, and having a partnership in place that you can really rely on is really important. There's many different solutions out there, but you need someone that can adjust both inside and the four walls of the warehouse, as well as from an overall network standpoint, and can help you adjust and deliver, despite the disruptions that are going on. And so, someone also with the breadth and depth of capabilities, maybe those are global capabilities, maybe those are just regional for your organization, maybe those are, beyond the warehouse and include transportation and brokerage, other aspects, right, that are important to you. can also weigh into the decision and finding a good partner that really helps you work through those disruptions. Again, not if they'll occur, but when they'll occur next.
That's great advice, Fred. Thanks for sharing that. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A section of this, or portion of this. Do we have any questions coming in from the audience? No? I've got one for you, Fred.
Yep.
You ready?
Let's go.
Visibility. All right. Visibility continues to be a challenge for us with our current warehouse provider. What should we expect from a warehouse in terms of inventory and information sharing and visibility?
Yeah, I mean, this has always been a hot topic, but I think even more so as of late. And from my perspective, the reason for that is because visibility, right, to what's happening within the warehouse equals control. And so if you can see and know and understand what's happening with your inbound containers or your inventory within the warehouse or your outbound order flow, you are able to better control, what you do, how you respond from a overall supply chain perspective. And so, your warehouse provider should be able to provide you with, kind of complete inbound, outbound inventory visibility across all of your products. Whether that's freight that's going to a transload center or a product that's flowing through, omni-channel fulfillment center. That's really kind of table stakes today. And so, we use best-in-class warehouse management systems to manage, each and every one of our warehouses, and they provide, visibility, and increasingly we're using AI tools as well to help, extract data and information. But it's more than that, right? It's really the insights that you can draw from that that allow you to better operate not only the warehouse, but also your overall supply chain. So those are a few things as it relates to visibility.
Thank you. And here's another one. How should we think about the pros and cons of a dedicated versus a public or multi-client warehouse?
Yeah, another good question, and maybe just to clarify or define those terms so that everybody understands what's meant by them. So a dedicated warehouse is a storage facility that's exclusively used, by a single company, or in our case, customer. So it means the entire warehouse, the space, the staffing, equipment, resources are all, dedicated to that, specific customer's needs. And so that's in contrast to what we refer to as a public or multi-client, or sometimes a shared warehouse, where, multiple businesses utilize the same building, maybe not the exact same space. There might be defined space within the building, but they're all under kind of one roof, if you will. And so, a dedicated facility provides some obvious flexibility, right? That the customer is able to kind of do what they wish within the four walls. There's control of that space. If they want to make changes, if they want to, tear down existing rack and build an automated shuttle system, right? That there's the flexibility to do that. The staff and the management within the building is also dedicated, and so again, they're focused on your business, your objectives within a dedicated facility. And again, that is contrasted with a public warehouse where you share much of the overhead in the building with other customers, so rent, utilities, insurance, management, etc., which can make it more cost effective, particularly if you're more of a small to medium size footprint. That can be more cost effective for you. But at the same time, right, you lose some of that control in terms of the building. So maybe might be more difficult to expand. For example, you have other customers in the space that the provider, right, has to consider. And so there's pros and cons to each. We see customers deploying a range of different solutions, really depending upon their business objective, size, and ultimate warehousing needs.
And follow-up question for you on this. I'm curious, what's that inflection point when companies are making the trade-off from a shared space to a dedicated space? Is it, dependent on size or by vertical or something else?
Yeah, I was trying to be somewhat vague, but you're going to push me on that. So, yeah, I think it's more size, really, right? I mean, it's less kind of vertical dependent, but as you approach, two, 300,000 square feet, I think customers tend to look for a more of a dedicated environment. That's not always the case, but maybe that's kind of a ballpark inflection point. Um, I think it also depends what's your forecast look like? What's your growth plan look like? Do you expect to need more space? Maybe multi-client is better, for you because maybe there's a way to take more space over time versus being kind of locked into 300,000 square foot building, for example. So again, there's pros and cons to each, but that's kind of where I would say we see customers start to think about a dedicated versus a shared environment.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. Thanks for expanding on that for
Sure.
us. Here's another one that came in. As a growing e-commerce brand, what should be my key considerations when it comes to selecting a warehouse provider?
Hmm. Yeah, I think e-commerce kind of by definition, right? If you're only selling online or through one of the marketplaces, you have some different requirements than maybe more your more traditional kind of brick and mortar consumer product. So many of the e-commerce brands that we work with, they're looking for providers who have a really strong technology platform that they can integrate with, typically via APIs to help support their business and also that they can help them grow, right? Most e-commerce brands and many that we've worked with start off relatively small. Maybe it's a very manual kind of operation, but as they grow and scale and add new product lines and expand their business, they're looking for a partner who's able to kind of go on that journey with them and support their business as it evolves. So that might mean deploying automation, right? What started as manual now we deploy some automation to help really just drive more velocity and more efficiency within the business. The other thing we see oftentimes is a lot of these e-commerce brands are looking for a one-stop shop. So they're looking for a partner who can not only handle the fulfillment of their orders, but can also work with them to get the best parcel rates and service possible. And certainly here at Maersk, we have that capability as well. And so that one stop to shop, right, particularly for some of these small and medium sized customers, they don't want to have to manage multiple partners. We're able to provide kind of a single rate for both the fulfillment as well as the outbound parcel to help make it easy, right, for e-commerce brands to do business with us. And I kind of touched on it earlier, but I think also just that supply chain platform being integrated, right, with the parcel solution, that might include things like the ability to rate shop different carriers, be able to manage orders across different facilities and locations and figure out what's best from a total cost and speed to market standpoint to get that order out to the customer just as quickly as possible. So those are all kind of things that we see e-commerce brands looking for in a warehouse provider.
That's great, Fred. Thank you. Here's another one for you. My current company uses a separate warehouse provider for managing returns. What do you recommend in terms of how to best manage returns from a warehouse perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a few different models out there. There's some large providers who just focus on returns. But I think what we typically see and what I think makes the most sense for most customers is to utilize the warehouse that shipped the order for returns as well. So there's a few reasons for that, right? So if you're shipping out of a facility in Southern California, for example, you see, there's an item to be returned, right? It can come back to that same facility. we can inspect, go through the product, make sure it's first quality, and if so, it's able to go right back into inventory at that point in time. Versus kind of a dedicated return scenario where you have to typically aggregate product, wait for loads to be made, and then it gets shipped back to the warehouse that originally fulfilled the order. That said, there's different models. I mean, that's typically how we see most of our consumer focus customers operating. I think returns just has become a bigger and bigger challenge. Quite honestly, it's a fairly messy part of the business in many ways. We've seen return rates for some customers approach 30-40% during and after the holiday season. So it's a really important factor, and it's a good question, Hillary, and something that customers should think about, companies should think about, particularly as e-commerce has grown, as that returns rate continues to go up as well.
And I'm curious, what about for products that can't go back into the marketplace? Does Maersk work with any recyclers or other types of disposal companies for those types of situations?
Yeah, absolutely. So across the country, we have providers that can help disposition, let me say, those products that don't go back into inventory. So whether that's kind of jobbers or folks that help kind of liquidate second quality inventory, or if it's consumer electronics and there's batteries and things like that that need to be disposed of in an environmentally friendly way, we can help with that. But yeah, that's all part of kind of what we do from an overall returns program management standpoint, for our customers.
Thanks for sharing that. So there's another question in here. I work for a large consumer products company, and we see major seasonality spikes in demand at several times throughout the year. How can the warehouse help manage these better for my business?
Yeah, good question. I think in general, we've seen some of the huge seasonality kind of mitigate or, over the last few years, but it's still significant, right? And so, ensuring that you have a warehouse provider that's able to flex up, that could be for back to school, or it could be Father's Day, or, the traditional Q4 holiday spike. It really just depends on your business. But, whatever the case, right, there's a few things that come to mind as to how the warehouse can help manage, this volatility for your business. One is really just, be sure you're collaborating with your provider on forecasting and planning. I mean, it really starts there. So you should be sharing, detailed sales and marketing forecasts, with your warehouse team so that they can align their staffing and their resources to best support your business. Things like, will you run a big promotion next week? Or, there's a new product launch coming. I mean, those are really important things. You may not think so, right? But they can have an impact on demand. And the last thing you want is a huge spike in demand and your provider not ready for it and able to handle that order volume. And that's in addition to, any, seasonality differences, you see throughout the year as well. The other thing that is important that we deploy is kind of what we call a dynamic slotting strategy. So, with a good forecast, we can adjust, where product is slotted within the warehouse based upon that forecast. So if there's a new product that's launching 2 weeks from now and it's already in the building, and you think it's going to be a really hot product that's going to do really well, we might pull that down from the rack, for example, and pick from a lower location just in order to be able to go faster and meet your order requirements and make sure we fulfill those orders in full and on time. So that's one example. The other thing is just space utilization. So if we know you're going to be building inventory in anticipation of a big sales push, right, and we'll see that coming in the forecast, right, we can figure out ways to help mitigate the impact to the facility. The last thing you want is product filling the aisles and not able to move within the current facility. That's not good from an efficiency standpoint. So are there things we can do to expand within the existing building, or take overflow space next door as a way to ensure that you have the space you need and we have what we need to be able to operate at a high level. In the end, it really comes down to that partnership approach and that clear communication, coordination with your warehouse partner, and what you see happening in your business, and ensuring that they're as well prepared for it as you are. Of course, forecasts kind of by definition, right, always change. They're never perfect, but having a solid plan in place and being able to adjust to that plan really allows your warehouse partner to better handle the volatility within your business.
Thanks, Fred. What a great note to end on. Some additional advice, much appreciated. That's it for the questions that have come in from the audience. So thanks so much, Fred, for your time today, for sharing these insights. And to our audience, we do have a short post-webinar survey coming up as we close out here, so please take a few moments to fill it out. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and Fred, enjoy your 75-degree glorious weather in LA while I overheat here in Richmond, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Hillary. Stay cool. Take care.